Thank you, everyone. So Geoffrey Chaucer. You might know him as the cliched father of English poetry, the medieval writer of the Canterbury Tales, a poet known for his bawdy humour and someone connected to the canon of English literature. He is, of course, all of these things. He was a Londoner, born and bred, who spent his life connected to the English court, both at home and abroad, a soldier, a diplomat, a high-ranking clerk, even a short-lived MP. And while he was engaged in these activities in his working life, he also wrote so much good stuff. A collection of tales that brings alive characters from across the subsections of English society in the Canterbury Tales, a tragic romance of love of epic quality in the Troilus and Crusader, provocative and elegiac dream visions, a translation of a work on philosophy, and even a highly technical piece of writing on astronomy. He wrote the laugh out loud, giggle to yourself, upturning stereotype stuff, and he wrote layered, smart, scratch your head kind of stuff too. He was interested in philosophy and mathematics and science and literature and poetry from all different kinds of sources. And he did all of this in English, or Middle English, a vernacular language still finding its literary feet in the late 14th century England, a time when Latin and French were central to a multilingual England. And these were languages that Chaucer also worked in. He was well versed in Italian, French, and Latin. So his writings tell us much about a lively European literary scene, but what about beyond Europe and outside of the medieval Latin Christian world? This is really what drives my research, thinking about the ways in which his work is connected to more global literary heritages, in particular the Islamic world, and the importance of uncovering this, not only to understand the medieval past, but its importance for our modern day discussions on multiculturalism and decolonization and diversity. So what I'd like to do in the next kind of 10 minutes or so is talk a little bit about some of these connections to the global and broader medieval Islamic world. Let's start with the Canterbury Tales itself. So you might know these tales, a group of pilgrims who set off from Southwark in London to Canterbury and tell tales along the way. And the whole premise of the Canterbury Tales is telling tales within tales, what we would call a frame tale narrative. Now, Chaucer was directly inspired by the Italian poet Boccaccio, whose Decameron also employs a frame tale structure. But both Boccaccio and Chaucer's texts sit within a constellation of frame tale narratives that developed and exploded across the Arabic Islamic world, with earlier roots in Sanskrit and Persian literatures. You might have heard of the 1001 Nights, also known as the Arabian Nights, as a prime example of this. But what I'm most interested in is the way in which his poetry and prose allows us to see the global lives of philosophers, of mathematicians and physicians who lived not in London, Paris or Florence, but in Baghdad, Cairo, and in places that we would call Europe today, such as Cordoba and Granada. But before we get to some of these figures and connections in his work, let's put this into some kind of perspective. So the medieval Islamic world from the 7th to the 15th centuries covered a large expanse of the geographical medieval globe, from the Iberian Peninsula, so the south of Spain, all the way into Central Asia, from Toledo and Timbuktu to the Bay of Bengal. Now, it wasn't a monolith, and this geography was always in flux, and there was no singular empire, but a series of caliphates, dynasties, sultanates, and emirates across a whole range of different geographies. And geographical communities that housed and thrived, housed different communities of faiths, Muslim, Jewish, and Christian communities who lived and thrived, where Arabic was a language that's known as a lingua franca, a common language that was used by many of these communities alongside Hebrew, Persian, and Latin. The Islamic world then was expansive and wide-ranging. It was multicultural, multilingual, and it wasn't cut off from Europe or the Latin Christian world. You can kind of see where England is positioned there. It's kind of a tiny block compared to the Islamic world. Now, there are lots of ways of thinking about the connections between and across these different spaces, through trade, through the movement of material culture, through the movement of people, and through the movement of text, which is what I'm most interested in. Across the 10th to the 12th centuries, a number of philosophical, medical and mathematical texts were translated from Arabic into Latin in centres and courts across the Mediterranean, so moving from places like Baghdad and Cairo into Sicily and the south of Spain. And from there, they moved into Northern Europe, into Paris and Bologna and Oxford and Cambridge, taught on university curriculums and distilled in encyclopedias. England has a noteworthy role to play in the story of this movement of Arabic learning into Western Europe. Lots of Englishmen travelled across to the Mediterranean, to the south of Spain in particular, in order to translate and be kind of engaged in the work of translation of texts from Arabic into Latin. But what did Chaucer know of any of this? Well, he certainly knew some of the most famous philosophers and scientists writing in Arabic, and we know this from his writings. So in the general prologue to the Canterbury Tale, when he's introducing all of the different pilgrims, he provides us with a portrait of the pilgrim physician. And in the pilgrim physician's portrait, the physician reels off his educational credentials. He wants to show off and tell everyone that he is a very perfect practitioner. He tells us he's read the works of a range of Greek and contemporary figures, so people like Hippocrates and Galen, but he's also read the works of a whole range of figures who are connected to the Islamic world, and I've highlighted them in yellow on the slide: Haley, Rhazes, Avicenne, Averroes, and Constantine. So Rhazes, for instance, is a 9th century Persian clinician whose medical compendium was translated into Latin and used in university curricula. Avicenna is the most famous Persian polymath who wrote a large-scale compendium of medicine known as the Canon of Medicine that was taught in university curriculum well into the 17th century. Constantine is a reference to a Christian monk from Kairouan, modern-day Tunisia, who translated works from Arabic into Latin in the monastery of Monte Cassino in Salerno. And he also gives us the name of this figure, Averroes, who I want to hone in on for a moment. Averroes, or Ibn Rushd, is a 12th century Arab philosopher from Al-Andalus, or Muslim Spain. He's best known in the Latin West for his commentaries on Aristotle, which earned him the wonderful title of the Great Commentator, a title that the Italian poet Dante bestows upon him. He calls him Le Gran Commento. In the 14th century, images of Averroes, such as the one that we see up here, appear in Italian fresco paintings. This is a snippet of a large-scale fresco image of Averroes sitting under the feet of the Dominican Thomas Aquinas. And this is in a very famous basilica known as Santa Maria Novella in Florence. Now, it's very likely that Chaucer saw this particular image and would have seen this image of this fresco and seen this image of Averroes when he was in Florence in the 1370s. And also gives us a sense that text and image, kind of visual images and what people are seeing and what Chaucer is seeing is also important for thinking about those connections between Arabic learning and his writings. But it's not just name dropping. Chaucer was also actively engaged with the scientific heritage of works written in Arabic by the Arabians in Arabic, as he puts it himself. The quote on the slide comes from the treatise on the astrolabe, his most technical piece of writing on an astrolabe, which I'll talk you through in a moment. And he writes this for his young son, Louis, and he tells him that English is a language that is sufficient enough in the same way that Arabic is for the Arabians, Hebrew is for the Jews, Greek is for the Greeks, and Latin is for the Latin folk. Now, the astrolabe itself, if you don't know, is one of the most exciting scientific instruments from the medieval period. It's an object that actually was really developed in the Islamic world, and it comes to Northern Europe through Al-Andalus and into France. It's a handheld object. It's a highly technical piece of a highly technical instrument. It's incredibly ornate. It's usually made of brass, and it's been likened to a medieval supercomputer. It allows you to do all kinds of different things, including timekeeping and charting celestial movement. It represents a spherical universe with a movable star map on the front, and encompasses a stereographic projection of the universe. So to hold one of these in your hand is a bit like holding the universe in your hand. So we know that Chaucer knew what an astrolabe was and knew how to work an astrolabe. We also know that he is reading texts that talk about how to use and how to construct an astrolabe. And we know that he uses a Latin translation of an Arabic treatise when he writes his own treatise on an astrolabe in English. Now, in 1929, a scholar known as R.T. Gunther published a book that connected Chaucer to this Arabic and Islamic literary heritage. He puts Chaucer directly alongside a figure called Messahala. This name, Messahala, is the Latin name for a 9th century astronomer and astrologer, Mashallah ibn al-Athari from Baghdad. And Mashallah himself was Jewish, he was ethnically Persian, but he was writing in Arabic and worked at the court in Baghdad. Now, the text itself, the use and the construction of the astrolabe, was not written by Mashallah, but rather by somebody working in Al-Andalus, so someone a bit more closer to home for Chaucer, known as Ibn al-Safar. And this example itself just gives us a sense of the wider genre of Arabic writings on astrolabes, which Chaucer's English treatise is really entangled into. So this is an example of a direct way that we can trace the textual heritage into the Islamic world. It requires a little bit of literary sleuthing, finding and discovering and tracing the movement of texts. And there are lots of other indirect ways that tell us so much more about these literary heritages and movements of text. And for this, we can go back to the Canterbury Tales. So in one of the tales known as the Squire's Tale, this is an unfinished romance, we get the name of another Arabic figure. This romance itself is set in the court of the Mongol king, Cambyuscan, or Genghis Khan. It begins with a feast, with a birthday celebration that's interrupted by a visitor, an envoy from Arabi and Ind, who brings with him a series of marvellous and wondrous gifts. Now, in the description of one of these gifts, we find a very kind of scientific description. One of these gifts is a magic mirror that allows one to see friend or foe. And when he's describing this gift, the discussion veers into a scientific discourse on perspectiva, or medieval optics. And it's here where we find this name, Aloken. So that's in that very first line on that quote. And Aloken is the Middle English version of the Latinized name of an Arabic figure known as Ibn al-Haytham. Now, Ibn al-Haytham writes this extraordinary treatise on optics known as the Kitab al-Manazir, that's known in Latin as De Perspectiva. It's actually better known in Latin than it is in the Arabic world during the medieval period. Now, in some of the work that I've done, I've traced this figure from Chaucer's reference to his direct source, the French Romance of the Rose. So that's the second quote on this slide. So Chaucer's reading the Romance of the Rose when he's putting together the Squire's Tale. That's probably where he gets this name from. The French itself is very, very interesting. The French writer Jean de Maine, when he's writing the Romance of the Rose, tells us that he knows something about the life of Ibn al-Haytham. In these lines, he tells us that Al-Haytham, the nephew of Hussein, was neither a fool nor a simpleton, and he wrote the Book of Observations. Now, you might not think anything of this, and critics have kind of dismissed it as a throwaway line, unless you know something about the life of Ibn al-Haytham. In the records that we have, in the Arabic biographical tradition and literary texts that we have, Ibn al-Haytham is said to have feigned madness in order to escape the clutches of a capricious caliph in Cairo. He's deemed a fool and a madman, a majnoon, which the French text tries really hard to defend him against. He's neither a fool nor a simpleton. He wrote a really interesting and great book. So we can only really understand Chaucer's reference in English to Aloken by understanding its connections and entanglements in both French but also Arabic literary traditions. So what does all of this mean? So these snippets that I've given you here tell us something about the entangled literary heritages from Baghdad to Cairo to Canterbury and London. It means that we need to orient Arabic and the Islamic world as a cultural force in Chaucer's writings in the same way that we understand Latin, Italian, and French to be. And that Arabic and the Islamic world is part of the multilingual fabric of what makes the longer history of English literature and the canon. And that's also really important for discussions about a global multicultural Britain today. And I want to end with my final slide with some very brief reflections in connection to a piece of art that was exhibited at the York Art Gallery in 2022. This is Sirat, a multimedia installation, an expanded, deconstructed, large-scale astrolabe, a work by the British Muslim artist Sara Chowdhury, a finalist for the Aesthetica Art Prize. Now, this envisaging of an astrolabe by Chowdhury is one that is connected to 17th century Mughal craftsmanship and to the artist's own Pakistani heritage. It's a work that's to do with movement and diaspora, of identity, of heritage, of the geographical and historical connections that connect to the past and present of a multicultural Britain. Much of this I also identify with as a British Muslim woman myself. But of course, we can connect this all the way back to Chaucer, that cliched father of English poetry, because astrolabes and their writing in medieval English literature was deeply connected to the Islamic world and the global lives of astronomers, scientists, and craftsmen who ended up connected to, and in the pages of, the work of this international Londoner, Geoffrey Chaucer. Thank you very much.
Thank you.